Welcome to National Parks Traveler, where we explore the national parks and the issues that involve them.
True birders are some of the most determined and persistent hobbyists out there. If you want to call bird watching a hobby, for many it's more like a passion. Many look forward to big day competitions where individuals and teams strive to see how many different bird species they can spot in a 24-hour period. This is Kurt Rappencheck, your host at the National Parks Traveler. Many birders log their sightings and identifications in eBird, a smartphone application created by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and the National Audubon Society. The good news is that millions of birders use this app. The concerning news is that their bird sightings over a recent 14-year period point to population declines in 75% of North American bird species. To learn more about this news, we've invited Dr. Amanda Rodewald from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology and Cornell University to join us today. We'll be back in a minute with Amanda.
Washington's National Park Fund is the official philanthropic partner serving Mount Rainier, North Cascades, and Olympic National Parks. WNPF raises funds for scientific research, youth experiences, volunteer programs, and projects that preserve and protect these national parks in Washington state. Learn how you can help at WNPF.org. Acadia National Park is one of the 10 most popular national parks in the United States. It's also one of the smallest and most vulnerable. That's why Friends of Acadia exists. Friends of Acadia is an independent organization of passionate people inspiring those who love this magnificent park to make a real and lasting difference for Acadia. You can make a difference at friendsofacadia.org. The Blue Ridge Parkway Foundation is the primary nonprofit fundraising partner for the Blue Ridge Parkway. It is made up of people who have a deep love for this majestic road and want to ensure that its natural beauty and the experiences it offers endure for generations to come. Show your appreciation at brpfoundation.org. Smokey's Life. Full of stunning photography and thought-provoking reads, Smokey's Life Journal is a biannual magazine produced by Smokey's Life, formerly the Great Smoky Mountains Association. Members receive it free of charge each spring and fall, and it is available for purchase in retail stores throughout Great Smoky Mountains National Park and online at smokieslife.org. Support from readers and listeners like you make the National Parks Traveler possible every day of the year. If you enjoy the Traveler's content, please consider a donation at nationalparkstraveler.org.
Welcome to the Traveler, Amanda.
Oh, well, thanks, Kurt. It's wonderful to be here.
I appreciate you making time. Birds. It's been a pretty rough 5 years in terms of tracking bird species across the world and across North America. Back in 2020, there was the report that more than 3 billion birds, I believe, had been lost from North America during the past 50 years. Before we get into the most recent report, can you explain how that 3 billion bird calculation was made and have any causes been attributed to the decline?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So, you're right. I guess just taking that step back, when we look at what we've learned about bird populations since that 3 billion bird paper, as we call it, it has been pretty sobering news. So the 3 billion bird paper that was published in Science, it showed, so what the scientists did is they were using estimates of population size that are produced by a large kind of partnership, public-private partnership called Partners in Flight. And this is a group that is really oriented around trying to protect and recover bird populations in North America. And so they've estimated population sizes, and then the scientists use the best source of long-term data on bird populations in North America, and that is the North American Breeding Bird Survey. That's run by USGS, and it's a volunteer-based effort where individuals have been running the same surveys year after year after year for 50 plus years. And so they calculated the trends in those bird populations and then really kind of extrapolated those to the population size of those birds in order to come up for the first time ever an estimate of the number of individual birds that have been lost. And so, yeah, I mean, it was really sobering. 3 billion sounds, of course, is an impactful number. It's hard to contextualize what that means, but it is almost one in every three adult, like breeding birds. That we have in North America were lost. And, for me, it really rings home because I was born in 1970, which was the first year that study looked at. So that's in my lifetime alone almost one in three birds have been lost. And you were asking the causes. That paper didn't really identify specific causes, but what we know if we look across, we saw declines across every habitat type, every, biome that we have across North America, every taxonomic group of birds, save, wetland and water birds, ducks and geese were doing better on average, but still you'd see declines across all of them. And so really it gives us a signal that, habitats are continuing to be lost and degraded, and that degradation can happen through many different reasons, whether it's climate change, pollution, development, or you name it. So yeah, that's what that paper was, one of the first real wake-up calls we've had in North America, that we're despite our strong record in conservation as a whole, we are not immune to seeing the kind of biodiversity loss that we're seeing around the planet.
Have you ever taken pause to wonder how many we've lost since 1492? I mean, you just go back to the 19th century and the flocks of passenger pigeons. I mean, I've read accounts where, they're miles long, they blacken the sky, they just keep coming and coming and coming. Has anybody tried to capture the number of birds we've lost since we got here?
I'm not aware of any studies looking at that in the entirety of North America. I believe some researchers at University of Wisconsin in Volker Radeloff's lab, I think, may have published a paper kind of reconstructing some of the pre-settlement bird communities in, I'm not sure if it was Eastern US or in the upper, Great Lakes or something. So readers might want to do some Google Scholar, or like listeners rather, might want to look at some Google Scholar, try to look up that paper. But yeah, we know, I mean, certainly ecologists have tried to reconstruct what some of the ecosystems looked like by using things like witness trees and, pollen cores and other, records of how land was used. But yeah, those estimates, we don't know. I think there are some good examples of, I guess we could probably, use some of the habitat associations we see today to try to reconstruct. But yeah, it would be a good exercise for sure.
And when we're talking 3 billion birds lost, any one particular species hit harder than another? I mean, are we losing more wetland birds than grassland birds or raptors or whatever?
Right. So when you look across either the 3 billion bird paper, the State of the Birds report that we just released in 2025, again, a recent one, or even with the paper we have, that we'll be talking about later today, what we do see is some really consistent signals that shorebirds and grassland birds are among the biggest declining groups. And so shorebirds, as you might imagine, those are, many of them are breeding in the Arctic tundra, and that's going to be disproportionately really hit by climate change. Shorebirds also undertake these enormous, just such impressive migrations, that span the entire hemisphere. And so they're exposed to many different ecosystems, many different threats. They often rely on very specific stopover locations in coastal areas that are then subject to a lot of stressors from sea level rise and from coastal development. I mean, if you look across the Americas, so much of our population, human population, resides near coastlines. So yeah, for shorebirds, they're a big declining group, and then grassland birds again. So grassland birds have probably lost about 2/3 of their total populations.
Wow.
And almost all species are in some state of decline. And what's interesting with the grassland bird story is that, I think a lot of people might initially hear that and would naturally and reasonably presume that it's because we've lost our native prairies. And native prairies are unique ecosystems, terrifically important for all sorts of reasons. But the truth is that many of these grassland birds persisted quite well alongside agriculture. We know that indigenous populations in North America used agriculture, had modified landscapes quite heavily to support, their own needs and resources, certainly after European colonization. And when agriculture started growing, that was the footprint was enormous across the eastern and central US. But so what it really is, rather, that's been tanking grassland bird populations is the intensification of agriculture. And what that's doing is we're, not only losing some of the hedgerows, the fallow fields, the areas that might not have been cultivated because previously they weren't quite productive enough without inputs of chemicals. Yeah, pesticides, those kinds of pressures, as well as woody encroachment that we're seeing in a lot of the sort of central Great Plains and south central Great Plains. So those are among the biggest drivers of grassland bird declines. And believe it or not, we still are estimated to lose about, in the Great Plains, 1 to 2 million acres of grasslands every year. And those are hard landscapes. So unlike, I know a lot of your focus, of course, is on national parks, where we have a little more capacity to manage those areas. But for grasslands, they're overwhelmingly privately owned. And so that requires a lot of creative and collaborative approaches that provide incentives to people for voluntary conservation measures. So yeah, so those are two of the biggest ones that jump out. But again, we see declines across all groups. I'd say the one positive story is overall wetland and water birds have done well, increasing overall if you look across all species. And, we think that reflects just the consistent and large investments by hunters and fishers in conservation. We know things like duck stamps, contributing fund state wildlife agencies, the excise taxes on hunting and fishing equipment, help to support, those agencies. Our national wildlife refuge systems were really built with the support of hunters and fishers too. So they're the one exception to the group of overall declines.
Yeah, you mentioned the 2025 State of the Birds report, and that, I believe, is Partners in Flight produces that, correct?
It's the North American Bird Conservation Initiative,
Yeah.
which is, yeah, just a slightly bigger group.
Okay. And we routinely report on that. And, as you mentioned, this year's report did mention declines in some common sea species, sea ducks, common eiders. And, of course, you mentioned the grassland birds, which my wife's favorite is the western meadowlark. She grew up in Wyoming, and very, very natural sound in the environment when you go outside. Lark buntings, forest species, pinyon jays in the Southwest. I know groups have petitioned the Fish and Wildlife Service to list pinyon jays as threatened for a variety of reasons.
And pinyon jay is one of the species that's been called a tipping point species. There's a group of conservationists called them, they're associated with the Road to Recovery. And they've identified a group of species that have lost half of their populations in the last 50 years and are on track to lose another half in the next 50. And they've, kind of refined it with some other ways to discern among species status, but pinyon jay is included among them. So certainly one of the, top 100 or so species we're worried about.
I'm wondering, you mentioned that astounding loss of grasslands each year. one of the units in the National Park System is Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve in Kansas, and I forget the numbers. I think once upon a time there was a 170 million acres or so of tallgrass prairie in North America, and we're down to a very single-digit percentage of that left over. And tallgrass prairie in Kansas preserves some of that. I'm just wondering, there's some national parks that have lots of prairie. Tallgrass prairie, of course, it's not that big. It's only about 11,000 acres, but you look at Wind Cave National Park and Badlands National Park in South Dakota, Theodore Roosevelt National Park. Any chances these places might serve as, I hate to say it, refugia for some of these grassland species? I mean, would they naturally flock, no pun intended, to these areas because they are protected?
Yeah, absolutely, because we know that for many bird species, they don't just need like certain kinds of habitat characteristics in any location, like at a small scale within, let's say, the territory they use, but they really respond to large contiguous areas of forest, or not forest, of land. So whether it's grassland or forest. And so national parks and other large reserves oftentimes can act as kind of an anchor for other conservation efforts, right? So you can imagine if you had this, really high quality grassland that's protected in the national park, that provides a sort of anchor and to have a source population where birds are able to reproduce and that population can grow. And if you have and restore or conserve other grassland and rangeland that's suitable for grassland birds around those parks, you're probably going to get much more return on that investment than you would otherwise, like if you were trying to just start from scratch with tiny little patches in a landscape. So yeah, these large protected areas do play very important roles in conservation as we build out these networks of conservation lands.
Do you know if anybody's ever done any studies on that? Like, this national park has a higher percentage per square mile or square kilometer of this species than outside of the national park?
There have been studies that have compared protected areas with whichever the species focal group to areas outside of protected areas. It's important to consider, a lot of other factors that might affect any differences too. So for example, we know national parks or other protected areas they're not just randomly placed on the landscape. So sometimes they're in areas that may not be as prone or as accessible for development as other areas might be. So sometimes there's a little bit of comparing apples to oranges in those kinds of studies. So there can be a mixed bag, but some of the recent analyses that have been done globally or even nationally, continue to show that there is a really important role to play for protected areas. When we look at bird populations in the US specifically, there have been past studies that have looked at kind of comparing the responsibility across different federal lands, like landowners, whether you're looking at Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, U.S. Forest Service, and National Wildlife Refuges that are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And those national parks on average don't, I think partly because they're many times, and we talk about, right, rock and ice wilderness and these landscapes that were selected maybe because they inspire awe. They're important culturally, recreationally, for other ecosystem services, but not always necessarily just for the birds. So other lands sometimes that may look less glamorous than some of our amazing national parks sometimes are hidden treasures when it comes to biodiversity as well.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Now, this latest report, which appeared in the journal Science back on May 1st, states that North American bird populations are shrinking most rapidly in the very areas that they are still most abundant. And I think it was a shocking percentage of decline in bird species. Was it 75% or?
Yeah, so right. So 83% of species and overall, like, yeah, so I guess it depends on what we're talking about. So 75% of almost 500 species are declining if you look across the range as a whole, everywhere they occur. If we look a little bit more closely at those patterns of declines, the pattern of declining most where they're most abundant, so in a way of like those strongholds, where the species were doing so well, we find that for 83% of species, they're declining in the strongholds. And so this is in some ways too, I mean, mirrors and is a kind of finer scale look at another pattern that had come out of the 3 billion bird paper and State of the Bird reports, where we're showing that its common species now are in decline. So you mentioned earlier passenger pigeon, right? And I know like when you hear those stories of passenger pigeon, it's like, oh my goodness, how could something so abundant ever be lost? That would never happen again. We would tune into it and prevent it. Well, we're now seeing very common species in serious decline, and we're seeing species are declining most strongly where they're most abundant. In other words, the areas that should be best able to support them, right? These aren't just range edges where they're declining, it's the heart of ranges, right? It's where, and so that is a real wake up call. And not only for conservation, but we also have to think like, right, when American robin is declining where it's most abundant, for example, we live in those places too. And so I always am, really aware of the fact that one of the big signals that this paper gives us doesn't relate only to birds, but really it's a wake up call about the environments we're living in. Because if environments are not healthy enough to sustain bird populations, well, they're unlikely to be healthy enough for people either.
This data in this paper was kind of teased out from citizen science reports on more than 36 million eBird checklists.
Yeah.
I mean, that's incredible, and applied roughly 495. You mentioned almost 500 bird species. How reliable is citizen science? I mean, I've tried to master eBird. We went down to the Galapagos a few years ago, and we had a tutorial from one of my wife's coworkers who was an expert on eBird, and I just kind of I didn't know what to think. But as I mentioned before we started this show, I'm very good at identifying LGBs, and I'm pretty good with grosbeaks and robins. But when you enlarge that to all the bird species out there, are you not concerned about misidentifications?
Yeah, so it's and so that's a great question. And I guess I'll say, I mean, talk first start maybe broadly. So one is just really if we think about all of the needs we have for information today, all of the challenges we're facing, the kinds of decisions we need to make if we're going to, not only protect species, but also be safeguarding ecosystem services and accommodating other human activities and, trying to marry all this stuff, the information needs far exceed what professional biologists would ever be able to collect. So the importance of participatory science programs in many different fields has just surged. Truly, individuals who participate in these programs are becoming kind of the eyes and the ears for conservationists and managers and decision makers around the world. eBird is the largest of the participatory science projects related to biodiversity. So globally, we now have almost 2 billion observations, and we've engaged about 1 million eBirders representing every country in the world. So, it really the footprint of it is just it's enormous and it's so valuable. What we do with eBird, because as you say, when you have individual volunteers are contributing data, that's always going to be prone to mistakes or to just other factors that we need to consider. So eBird uses a sort of different it deals with quality control at different stages. So when someone is submitting their checklist, for one, we encourage best practices. So the data we use in our analyses are what we call complete checklists. So that would be if you went to a location and you record every species that you see or hear, right? Every bird you detected. We can then infer by association which species are not there. So its presence and absence data are included in a complete checklist. So when these checklists are submitted, so we encourage people to do that. We encourage them also to, keep their survey periods fairly short and not move over tens and, 20, miles, to keep it to a location that we're able to characterize in terms of the environment. So we have those kinds of practices. When then they submit their observations, we do have a system of filters that gives an alert if someone is submitting a species or a count of individuals for a species that would be unusual for that location. So those observations would be flagged, and then whoever's submitting that observation would be able to double check what they're doing, double check their identification, maybe take a picture, a photo, documentation to prove it's something unusual. And then those are also then reviewed by regional experts who then are, in those locations, are expert birders who can then actually interact and engage with that observer, that participant, in order to determine, okay, is that a credible observation or not? So that's sort of on the data entry side, quality checks. Once we have the data, then we can use a series of different analytical approaches to statistically control for other issues. So we're able to adjust for and statistically account for differences in effort. Was it one person out there on birding in the team? Was it three people on the team? Was it a moving checklist or a stationary checklist? What was the time of day? Right? Those kinds of factors. We are able to as well model the expert level. We have a score for each. It's anonymous, so we don't know individuals. Can't look up scores. Birders can be very competitive.
I've heard.
But we're able to model based on all the checklists that people have submitted, and we know what's expected in those areas based on others. We can tell, well, how many of the species are they getting? And so we can actually track improvements in individuals over time and factor that into our analysis. And we do lots of different, validations. And so again, a really sophisticated methodological approach has made us very confident that our estimates are really rigorous. And we oftentimes will point to the fact that government agencies, private industries, they're relying on and actually using our data, as well as like the scientists, like, with us when we were publishing that. And if groups who can be litigated, like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, have the confidence to use these data and in our methods, that's really telling. So you're right. Anytime we're using participatory science data, we need to be careful. There's lots to really consider, and it's very prone to having problems, but those problems can be addressed in a variety of ways.
What time period was considered for this data collection? I mean, I'm wondering how you filter out just a bird's natural behavior. There might be better forage over here, or a wildfire over there. I know, we've got feeders in our yard, and a few years ago we had just incredible number of evening grosbeaks show up and spend quite a few weeks. I think it was in the springtime, getting ready to move up into the shrublands. We haven't seen gatherings like that, and is that indicative of a loss of bird numbers, or could it be they move 5 miles down the road?
Yeah, well, some species are can be nomadic or eruptive. like some of the species that you might mention. So like pine siskin, I was just out in the Pacific Northwest in British Columbia, and it's a huge pine siskin year. They're just blanketing everywhere. In that area, that species is kind of eruptive. And then numbers can sometimes, then subside after as they're moving and tracking big massed crops of seeds. So you have some of that movement that's happening. Certainly. And so species that are known to be eruptive and nomadic, you will see more of these kind of boom bust cycles. But over long time periods, like in the 3 billion bird paper, a 50-year time period, that signal, of the variation, these annual fluctuations, isn't going to be driving the trends we see over longer periods. In shorter time periods, that could be the case. If you just looked over a 2 or 3 year period, certainly you could think you might see a huge decline if you were only looking in one place, I guess. That's one of the values of eBird is that we're looking over, we can simultaneously track numbers, estimate numbers across the full range of species. So you can imagine it's kind of if it's rising in one place and going down in another, we can see that it's more likely to be movement than if we're just seeing a slow sort of sinking of all of these populations.
And what time period of data was this recent paper based on?
It was in 2007 to 2019 or 2021 rather. And so we have that in the paper and up on if people are interested on the eBird status and trends website, there we're showing a narrower period because we can estimate even more species. So it's from 2012 to 2022.
And has the decline accelerated in recent years?
What we're seeing, so there we'd have to look at sort of apples to apples. So the recent years, looking state of the birds would be the best comparison looking across years. And we do see that, yeah, there are steeper declines for almost every biome group if we, are adding in the last few years of data compared to just the 2019. And here in this science paper that we're talking about, looking at eBird trends, really what's so important about this paper is we're not just calculating some declines across the range, but this is the first time we've ever been able to look at such fine spatial resolution. So we can actually look at variation in population change in landscape scales. So in 27 by 27 kilometer or 17 by 17 mile areas, so pretty small. And so one of the insights that gives us is we can see that so 97% of species show that there are some areas of increase and some areas of decline. Right. So it's for most species, they're not tanking everywhere, or they're not, and I guess no species are really increasing everywhere at once. And that sort of spatial resolution is transformative for conservation because it really shows us where we need to focus or direct our resources. Right? This wouldn't matter so much if we had all the resources in the world and could do everything, everywhere all at once. But we can't. We need to make difficult choices. And so now we can see, all right, where are populations most abundant and declining most steeply? Where might we be seeing some increases and where we can look for lessons about, what is working for conservation or where there might be hope for restoration? That view really informs decisions in a way that we can't when we are looking at population trends at like statewide levels or regional levels or even across the range. So that's one of the things we're so excited about with this paper in particular.
Are there areas that are increasing?
If you look across all birds, if I were going to stack up all the population trends of every single species in North America, there are some areas that are technically, blue overall. But I mean, so we do have individual birds are declining, kind of individual species are declining. Kind of, you can find wherever you are some species that are in decline. Absolutely. But yeah, it's interesting. So some areas of the Appalachian Mountains are show like kind of just overall, if you looked at just numbers of birds, right, where they're increasing. Some of the areas even in like in northern Nevada, are showing some of those increases as
What what what
well. But
what type of species?
I mean, I'd have to look. I'm not prepared to talk of any one, but so with us, it's more interesting usually to talk about different biome groups, right?
Yeah.
So because that's where we really start understanding kind of some of these patterns we are seeing. In terms of the national parks, I would say like some of the things that really stand out, if we look at like arid land birds, right? Species that use like desert scrub, in the Southwest. I mean, as you might expect, national parks end up being really important for some of those species, in those areas. When we are looking like wetland and water birds, a lot of the national parks, like in Alaska, have been critical for some of our most severely declining shorebirds as well. And if we were to look across at like all the abundances, I was just looking at some other information we have. There are like 26 species that have over, between 10 and 34% of their US abundance, their populations, at some point during the year are occurring on National Park Service lands. So that is a really meaningful amount.
When you mention, for instance, the Appalachians and some increases there or stability there, what can you ascribe that to? Is it birds being forced out of other areas and they're finding refuge, so to speak, in the Appalachian Mountains, or the climate's a little bit nicer, or they like the fall colors?
Yeah, so there's a variety of different factors. For some species, I mean, there is some elevation. So certainly, there is, maybe the ability to move upslope, if conditions are becoming warm. But I think a lot of it is also due to the eastern US has been becoming more forested over the last century or two, even though we're reforesting, even though now we're losing some of our largest patches of forest. What we see with some of the forest species is more of a shift. We see divisions along the extent to which species rely on early successional habitat, shrubby, regenerating habitats of forest, which is still considered forest, or late successional forest. So a lot of our late successional forest species are actually doing relatively better than a lot of the species that require shrubby forests in the eastern US. And so things like I don't know, prairie warbler, grasshopper sparrow, those are some early successional species. And so those as a whole in the eastern US, yes, species that rely on disturbance, cutting, fire, windstorm events, those kinds of things are faring more poorly than some of the ones that like really dense closed canopy forest. But it is a mixed bag because every species, of course, has its own needs. I'd say in some of these bright spots too are because we have really active conservation efforts in the Appalachians. The Appalachian Mountain Joint Venture has been, really successful in working with forest industry, with different whether it's mining companies, to make sure that we're finding ways to get conservation out on the landscape in ways that aren't necessarily shutting down other, economic activities that are really important in those regions as well.
One thing that I'm sure my listeners will say, Kurt, you said that enough, is the value of natural capital held in wildlife and in natural resources. And I know there have been studies on the value of a grizzly bear or the value of a wolf. I mean, you look at Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks, and they've made a fortune in tourism dollars because of the wildlife there. And birders bring a great deal of economic impact too, no?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there was this earlier this year, there was a report that was released by Fish and Wildlife Service, and it showed it was that there were, I think there are 96 million birders in the US. So if you look at the adult, yeah, I said 96 million, right? And so if you look at the adult population, that represents about half of US adults bird watch or bird feed to some extent. And those activities collectively generate $279 billion of economic activity each year in the US. And that's through, travel for birding, that's through purchasing equipment, purchasing bird seed, visiting restaurants when they're, out in their favorite birding location. And so it's a significant, input to our economy. So birders can be an economic engine.
Well, yeah, and I'm wondering, you've got that segment of active birders across the United States. You've got folks like Ducks Unlimited. There's the Wild Turkey Foundation, hunters and backcountry anglers, whatever. With all those groups and all the support of conservation that they offer, why are we seeing such drastic declines? Is it just the human footprint?
Yeah, we do continue to, I think especially in, the global north and particularly in the US, right? Not only are our populations growing, but the amount of resource use is really outstrips even population growth. So we continue to increase the amount we're, consuming and using, lands for development, it continues to increase. And so I think there are probably, we have, a lot of people wonder about like climate change. Is that really what's causing the most of the impact? And climate change is of course hugely important and does affect many species directly or indirectly, but it still comes down to the fact that it's habitat loss and habitat degradation for most of the species are the most important contributors. But we can do better now. A lot of the times, previously we just didn't have the amount of information that we have today. Today we have the ability to be much more precise in our conservation efforts in a way that allows us to be more flexible in how we're accommodating other social and activities that need to happen to sustain, rural economies or, other important parts of sort of economic base as well. And so I think even though it is a really kind of dark picture sometimes, we have more information than ever, and knowledge is power. And the other reason why I have a lot of hope is that when we think back again to the link between bird populations and human populations, we rely fundamentally on the same environments, right? And so the actions that we need to take to save bird populations are more often than not the same actions that we should be taking to protect human health and well-being, right? We benefit from healthy ecosystems. And so the more, I think now we're really seeing more and more that human health and bird health, let's say, align. And so it's not a matter of do we do something to protect, birds or do something to protect people? What we really need to be doing is thinking about the creative ways that we can meet the needs of both. And so that confluence gives me a lot of hope for the future.
But then you look at current events, and we have an administration in Washington that really seems hell-bent on developing fossil fuels, that is cutting away at environmental regulations, that is attacking the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. and I could go on and on and on. Is there a way to work collaboratively some way so those efforts don't further hinder or increase the decline in bird species?
Right, and it is a scary time in those respects. So I mean, I guess there's a lot of I mean, we of course, we know that the power of sort of voting and collective action. I mean, there are all those ways that people, are expressing, have expressed, and continue to express, their care for the environment. I think there are a lot of really strong value propositions for conservation. Again, conservation is not an altruistic activity. We benefit as well, right? There are economic, benefits that stem from conservation, productivity to crops because birds and other species provide pest control services, to them and their forests. I mean, there's all sorts of reasons we derive benefits from the same services and healthy ecosystems that other species do. I would say that what one of the important things that we need to do, in addition to being like, sort of active and supporting conservation groups, expressing our, what we care about to our representatives, is being part of this back to the citizen science or participatory science, right? Is helping to bear witness to the changes that are happening out there. And I think that's where, to me, it's really exciting to see this paper out in Science, to see State of the Birds and other kinds of publications showing that individuals who are out there watching birds and who take a moment to submit those observations to eBird, they are actually helping to give us the information we need to do better. They're giving us the information we need to be able to detect declines before they become so severe that they're not really tractable in terms of trying to address them, or they become too costly. And so that is, I think, like just, seeing that an activity that brings people joy, that improves physical, mental health by being out in nature, also is actually supporting conservation because truly these eBird data are used around the world to support environmental and conservation decisions, that are being made every day. So I think that is legitimately one way that people can contribute or be a part of change.
Sure, sure. And I think to a large degree, and some people will disagree, to a large degree, I think that conservation and environmentalism is apolitical, because no matter what political identity you have, there are a lot of people who are hunters and birders and anglers, and they could be Republicans or Democrats or independents, far right, far left, whatever. A lot of Americans have found joy in the outdoors. And I'm just wondering if there's been given any thought to a national campaign to tap into that, to let them know of the great declines that we're seeing across conservation areas in America. And, once upon a time we thought the bald eagle was going to go extinct, and yet campaigns brought it back to where, I can see one almost every day now. Has any thought been given to such a national campaign?
Yeah, and I think we see that with some of the groups like the NABC, or the North American Bird Conservation Initiative, right? That's one of the reasons State of the Birds reports are released. Those are going to decision makers, and we show in that report, how support for birds, support for conservation does, as you say, cross political lines, right? It spans the full spectrum. A lot of conservation, every conservation organization also has their own audience as well. But certainly there are groups like Ducks Unlimited that has a, really great reach, across the political spectrum. And they've been a part of a lot of the science, that's helping us, and also communication about these declines. So yeah, I would say that those efforts have been underway. In the past, they've also even, the bird conservation community has even tried to, and just more, excuse me, wildlife conservation community has been trying to pass legislation called the Recovering America's Wildlife Act that has received bipartisan support, and it has gone through various versions to try to come up with a broader source of funding to support wildlife conservation in ways that benefit people, across the whole country. Unfortunately, that hasn't made it out yet, despite the strong bipartisan support and budget neutral mechanisms they've come up with sometimes.
And not a lot has made it out of Congress.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Amanda, it's been a fascinating conversation, and hopefully the next time we get together, we'll be talking about increases in birds. But before I let you go, where's your favorite birding area, and what's your favorite bird?
Oh, well, that is a great question. So I will say, just because it's national parks, one that is near and dear in my heart is Glacier National Park. That's where I got my first job out of college when I finished at University of Montana, and I was up surveying birds and up the North Fork, for people who might be familiar with it. And so the very wild part of the park. So yeah, Glacier National Park will be special because it was where I really first learned how to survey birds. And so there, I don't know which species there. To be honest, ruby crown kinglet, a very diminutive, understated bird, but that was one that I really adored hearing so frequently out there in the forests of Glacier.
Well, maybe you can help me. I remember hiking up Avalanche Creek, and I can't remember if it was a thrush or a warbler. Very distinctive song that followed me up the trail.
Oh, really? Yeah, but I don't know. There probably would be a few, maybe some buried thrush, if it sounded like a UFO-y kind of.
Yeah, that might have been it. So have you gone in search of the ivory-bill woodpecker yet?
No, I have not. Yes. You? How about you? Yeah.
No. I've been to Congaree National Park, but not deep enough in the woods to look for it there. But there's still time left. Well, thanks again so much for joining us, Amanda. It's been really interesting. And like I said, hopefully down the road we'll get together and talk about some really impressive news on rebounding species populations.
I would like that. Yeah, I'd like that very much, Kurt. Thanks so much for inviting me.
That's our show for this week. We hope you found it interesting and even inspires those who aren't serious birders or who don't already use eBird to spend a little more time searching for birds. Your work could be of great help to scientists like Amanda Rodewald, who track the ups and downs of bird populations. For The Traveler, this is Kurt Repenchek. See you in the parks.
The composers and musicians at Orange Tree Productions have created a unique collection known as the National Park Series that has grown to include more than 30 CD titles. Composed against the backdrop of a park's sounds of nature, these musical scores will connect you with these beautiful places and take you there, at least in your mind. This collection is the #1 selling National Park audio series in the world and provides the background music for National Parks Travelers podcasts. Visit them at orangetreeproductions.com. Editing and production work for the National Parks Traveler podcast is done by Splitbeard Productions. You can learn more about us at splitbeardproductions.com. National Parks Traveler is a 501c3 nonprofit media organization that provides daily editorial coverage of national parks and protected areas. Traveler's coverage is made possible by reader and listener donations. Visit us at nationalparkstraveler.org.